At the I'm not wearing a dog shirt, but I'm wearing a dog.
And
I was like, oh man, they got to get me in this room. I'm going to drop him. He's a puppy,
Tuesday,
you know. So
August 25th, 2020, 5:03 p.m. We are late because of a combination of Crowdcast technical difficulties and a dog joke. It was worth it. If you want to see such things in the future, you got to join us on the Crowdcast version of the show. The YouTube version, which is kind of official, doesn't get that pregame action. There are like 70 days till the election. Is that the right number?
I
I'll
think
pull
he
up the
posted
actual
71
numbers.
today.
71.
It's 71 today, and something like 75 more days than that till inauguration.
It's going to be a long, long time in between that election day and inauguration, the longest period we've ever had.
It is, although I do want to say, and we're going to talk about this, if our guest is right, we already know the results of the election, so we don't have to be stressed out about it. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we are continuing our series on election forecasting, what it's worth, and what the best ways to do it are, and is there a world beyond Nate Silver? And we are doing that with our guest today, Rachel Bitecover. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm here with my Starbucks Frappuccino coffee. It's I actually usually have a homemade version, but today I have the real thing, and that's what I'm
you were just
drinking.
going to stop with like, I usually have a home. And that was just going to be like, you're like, I'm actually in my green screen tent.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. So, like, I thought this was a podcast, and I didn't realize it was going to be on video. So, like, I am, like, not ready.
No,
I haven't. Do you want me to go first with the not ready?
I wear dog shirts every day on this just to keep the formality level as low as possible. Kate often talks about how many days it's been since she's showered. We're low-key on in lieu of fun.
You're in good hands.
Luckily, I preemptively knew I was coming on Tuesday, so as a returning guest, I quickly bid to be a host on the Friday show.
That's right. You're going to be back on Friday.
Yeah, I will find a way to wear a dog on Friday and be here bright-eyed and bushy-tailed.
I'm excited about it.
Where are you?
All right.
I'm in Hampton Roads, Virginia. It's just coastal Virginia. Yeah, this is where I began my illustrious and accidental career as an election forecaster. So
all right, so let's get into it, because this is an interesting story, and you have an alternative way of predicting elections that enrages some people, energizes other people, and you also have a second life as one of the Lincoln Project folks, which I want to talk to you about the apparent tension between life one and life two. But first, let's talk about the Bitecofer model. When people think of election forecasting, they immediately think of Nate Silver and these very complex poll-driven models of the type that 538 popularized. Your idea is really different. You don't update your model very often. You release it really early in a cycle. And you were really close to dead on balls accurate in the 2018 midterm. So what's the theory behind your model, and how does it work, and why do you think it is better than other models?
No, so here's one thing I should point out. I actually don't. I think better is a normative thing, right? Different, right?
I mean, if you thought their methodology worked better than yours, you'd do
yeah. So I think what my work is a theoretical advance, right? I think it's taking into account a political reality in which an American population could elect a man. First off, a Republican Party could nominate a candidate like Donald Trump, which is not something that would normally be possible. And then further, the American population could, albeit by a little bit of electoral happenstance and freak accident, send him to the White House. Because that is not something, and it's really important that people should understand, and it kind of answers your question as to why thing one could be connected to thing two in terms of my biography. That is not something that should be happening in a healthy body politic, because Donald Trump is a utterly incompetent and corrupt individual, and in a healthy democracy would not be the president. So, those, what my main contribution, I think, isn't so far on the mathematics end of the modeling, although, I will be soon announcing some changes to that I'm really excited about. That's going to kind of spice it up, the negative partisanships, statistical product with a partnership that I'm really, really jazzed about. But what is innovative is the theory, and the theory is arguing that we are in a polarization is not just a thing; it is a quantifiable aspect of American politics that we can measure, we can empirically demonstrate in Congress, we can show it in the courts, we can show it in the executive, in the presidency, and we can show it in the public. And what I'm doing is taking that and I am extending it to electoral behavior, to the actual voting, whereas previously mass polarization had been measured more just as a construct of public opinion. So, when I think about Nate Silver's stuff, though Nate Silver and Nate Cohen and those guys have decided for whatever reason that they don't want to engage with me or be friends, I'm still a big girl and I have big girl panties. Their work is still, and especially Silver's, very, very terrific. And in terms of probabilistic polls-based fundamental forecasting models, the 538 model is a terrific product.
So why do they turn up their nose at you? What's the source of you've just been very gracious and described it as one way. Why is your respect for their work not reciprocated?
Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to ask them. I will tell you this, though, just for context, this is a problem that's isolated within a small group of these guys. It's respected in other circles where people know what they're doing and understand the mathematics behind the stuff that we do. So it's unfortunate, but what can you do?
All right, so let's talk about the track record of your model, which has, first of all, as most viewers will know, did extremely impressively in 2018. It is younger than 2016, so it didn't have the chance to either prove itself or fail as spectacularly as some other models in that context. So I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Elliot Morris and that I've been poking Nate Silver with for a long time, which is, how do we know? Back in 2016, I did a very, very crude model, which was a single Excel spreadsheet, which I made public, that in which I gave a rough guess of my sense of the chance of Hillary Clinton's winning each state. I multiplied that chance by the number of electoral votes. I added them all, and I came up with she had a pretty damn good chance of winning, which was very similar, of course.
It's like the Lichtman model.
Yeah, well, except
I've heard a few other models had that.
Except
it
wasn't based on bullshit, right? It was based on, here's my gut impression of the chance in every state,
right?
Which was informed by whatever it was informed of. Here's, what happens if no fancy analyses, it's not particularly poll driven. It's just the Wittes impressionist,
right.
per state, right? add up the expected value, you get a certain number of electoral votes. It came out really close to Nate Silver's, probably because I was informed by their sense of the probabilities in each state, but who knows, maybe because, about 70-75% chance was pretty reasonable guess. And my question has always been to the 538 guys is, how do you know your model was any better than mine? You said Clinton had a 28-29% chance of winning. I said, or 28-29% of losing. I said she had a pretty damn good chance of winning. How do you know that that your model outperformed mine? Mine took about 20 minutes to make. Yours took hundreds of hours.
In a binary sense, they were both incorrect.
According to Nate, they were both 22% correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, they both did reasonably well.
Right.
One took an enormous amount of work. One
I was just going to say 22% naked or 22% pregnant. Like, that's kind of like what the...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
one could literally have been done on the back of a napkin.
Yeah.
And so my question is, how do we know, without going through thousands of electoral cycles that none of us are going to live to see, whether your model is in fact a significant advance, or whether you were lucky in 2018, and Nate's right to have his nose in the air about you, although it's impolite. I just don't know, this is really the same question that I asked Natalie Jackson. How do we know what the basis for comparison is?
Yeah, I mean, so for Nate and Elliot's models, one of the advantages that they have is that they're able to back test them. So they're able to take the system that they have devised for the 2020 cycle or the 2016 cycle, and then they run that same model for the elections that they already know the results on.
That doesn't move me at all, because you can tune data to predict the past. Really?
Well, yeah, it'd be different if they were changing it per cycle. But the way that would work, a back test, is you have this set of variables, this set, it's a strident set, and then you apply it to all the elections past. That's the same set.
Except that you wrote the model with an awareness of what happened in those elections.
Right, and you're using that to predict the future, right? Because if it's predictive of the past, it should be decently predictive of the future.
Unless, as you claim, variables that anticipate that are at issue now.
And that's why Elliot's building in this polarization, and Nate's trying to figure out how to deal with that as well, right?
So, but for those of us who are sitting here in 2020 and say, I don't want to have a kind of my model can beat up your model fight every year. I just want to know who the best modeler is so that we can, trust that person and ignore everybody else.
Right.
What's the acid test that we should use? Is it how many electoral votes each side gets? Is it how spectacularly wrong? That would be,
I mean, here, Ben, let me try to help you guys. Okay, here's the thing. Number one, it's not mapping a genome, so it's not going to give you a hard answer, right? Social sciences tend to give you soft answers. So if you read academic work, you're going to find even in pretty good studies that have pretty robust findings, the social scientists are going to use pretty cagey language, as in these findings are suggestive, or this is indicative of a relationship, but it's not going to say definitively this means A causes B, right? And that's because you're just not going to get that kind of certainty, right? So when you're asking me, okay, I'm an election buff, and I also care deeply about the country, and now these elections are life and death for the country, and I just want to be able to decide, out of this menu of options, which one can I have confidence in? Granted, I'm going to be a little biased on this. I mean, Nate would argue, well, you want to go with the one that has consistently performed, which is fine in a circumstance like this this election right here, at least up till now. And I don't think there's going to be a fundamental change to it. Obviously, I've been arguing that for 16 months or 13 months since my model first released, in which one candidate really sucks and has a structural disadvantage, and there's a pretty sizable advantage, and it's not going to be a 2000 election, because if it was, Nate's model or Elliott's model, which are specified differently and have different terms of existence, would both be telling you something that's not altogether useful, and that is it's a 50-50 outcome, right? So like I could flip a coin and tell you there's a 50% chance that Trump's going to win or Biden's going to win, and that's a limitation of probabilistic models. If the outcome in the data that's being fed into the model is suggestive that one candidate has a strong advantage over the other, as is the case in 2020, as was the case in 2016, though there was a major signal in the data that wasn't getting fed into the model, and we can circle back to that, then you're going to get these, decisive probabilities that say, well, the probability is really pointing, it's close to 1 that it's going to come out this way. Otherwise, probability models, unless they're leaning one way or the other, are not all that definitive, right? And so for me, what I care about is like the theory. Like I care about like who, what is the thinking and rationale behind the analysis. So like on my end of the work, like my model, like the way that I have thus far modeled negative partisanship is to be described, I think, by any statistician as rudimentary. It's a structural model. It's been deep, generally accepted fine within the political science community. Nate puts his nose at it because for his rationale really is that I don't just rely on the model output. I then apply qualitative assessments the way that crystal ball, the crystal ball, Larry Sabato's crystal ball would. Like I don't stick to the hard number that comes out. If I know that Arizona in this model is going to produce a lower turnout two-party vote share because my model is based on history and it's realigning to the left, so it's kind of constrained in that way, I'm going to say, you know what, though, Arizona is probably going to overperform my model because no model is going to be perfect. And, Nate and Elliott and those guys look down on the model for that way. These new modeling techniques that my co-author is going to be introducing are probability-based models, so they're much more in line with like what people are used to looking at, and I think they're pretty cool. They're not polls-based. They're not tweaks of what Nate and Elliott do. They're a completely different approach, and they're modeled negative partisanship versions of what my theory is about. But ultimately, what made my stuff work and the reason I was able to come in on July 1st in 2018, 4 months before Election Day, and say, yeah, you guys are having the wrong conversation. It's not can they pick up these 23 seats to take control of the House. They are 100% going to pick up those 23 seats. The question is, how many more on top of that are they going to pick up? Because my guess is they're going to pick up about 20 more. And here's where this model has identified places in suburban areas that have always been good for Republicans, at least over this 10 years that really the data analytic, like election analysis, election Twitter world has always existed, that have never had a surge turnout, Democratic enthusiasm electorate appear from. And this is where I think it's going to be. It's going to be Orange County, which has been voting for Republicans for 30 years. It's going to be Richmond, which is gentrified and grown a whole bunch. And so, to me, as a trained political scientist, in political science, you can have a fancy model and you can send it to a journal, but if you don't have a theory, like a reason to run the model, it's not worth a lot. And I think right now, as we're looking at Western democracies across the world struggling, ours is obviously the most struggling, followed by the UK. We're looking for explanations. Why is democracy struggling at a time period really where we should be more stable, not less? And I think the people who follow my research are looking for that more theoretical richness. I don't think the research should be controversial. There is, unfortunately for me, my research doesn't usually always get described correctly to people. So sometimes it gets described in this Politico article that came out about me, had a clickbait headline. Oh, there is no swing voter. That's certainly not what my research argues. Only a moron would make that argument. And, Nate Cohen chooses to tell people that that's what my argument is, even though he's been corrected on it like 85 times. So, what can you do? But ultimately, it's that explanation of, okay, how do we live in a country in which we're having smart, serious people are having serious qualms about whether we're going to have a peaceful transfer of power,
right?
That's something we've never talked about, right?
So yes, no, that's everything you said is true, but I want to kind of like get back to kind of the heart of a couple of things. So
cool.
I am a person who does not believe in election models, and it has been very controversial in this show. I am a social science empiricist, so like
cool,
we can argue about like p-values and other shit, but like basically like I'm going like I think that there's
great.
I think that like it's really hard. One of the problems I have just at a very basic level with the empirics of models is that like they're drawing between disparate events that are happening 4 years apart, in which there is like X number of things happening in between that, or like or shorter distances of times, depending on like the whether or not there have been like Senate and like House elections in various districts. And they're trying to, but regardless, they're trying to use past events to dictate future events, to which I say, like, more or less. And, like, it's not, and, like, the rise of, like, Nate Silver and everything else, like, I'm not, like, dismissing, like, the work that you do. I should also, like, say that really off the bat. I didn't mean to, like, blow raspberries.
Oh, no, don't worry about it.
No. I was just, like, trying to say that, like, I think it is a very specific thing. I think that you and Nate and other people understand the limits of it. And then I think other people take a lot more certainty and a lot more confidence from it than is necessarily correct. But what I'm kind of interested in is like, you keep like talking about your model and like the ways in which your model is different, but like, and the theoretical basis of your model. And so like, let's talk about that for a second.
Sure.
Let's sum up the theoretical basis of your model. Like, what is different about your model that is like, and like you can say an overriding theory, but then like even talk about specific elements of things that you look at that like you feel like the other modelers are not looking at.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So really what I'm arguing is that as we move through the age of polarization, which for the public is a very constrained time period, so much so that a big book comes out in the mid 2000s called, Culture War, the myth of the polarized public, and it gets kind of taken as like a Bible almost, like, oh, there's no polarization because people's like preferences on issues are still following the bell-shaped curve and are clustered around the middle, which is actually still true to today, right?
But also the preference.
That's the Mo Fiorina book.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
And also the preferences don't dictate actions. So like being pulled on preferences doesn't necessarily dictate you walking your ass to the fucking polling place at your local school.
Yeah.
And
yes, no doubt. You're going to love my theory because like there's like I read that book and then like I actually thought like we were going to have this really critical like takedown of it because like that's how my whole experience in grad school was like I would like something, we'd go in there and then everyone would destroy it. I'd be the only one that liked it. And then like this was like the opposite for Mo Fiorina's book. And I was like, okay, what the hell? Because this book is not well done quantitatively or theoretically argued. And so anyway, that's what I decided.
At Stanford, so.
I know, he's a great guy. Doesn't matter if So anyway, and I'm on Team Alan Abramowitz. When you look though at public opinion data, and I start to prove this book wrong for my dissertation, it's actually like really shocking. It goes like off a cliff in 2008, 2009, and there's two major events that happen at the same time. So it's really hard to untangle which it is. It's probably both, and how much of each it is. But two things happen. The economy collapses and the nation elects Barack Obama, who happens to be not only a Democrat but a Black Democrat, right?
So just to be clear, is this are these events that are building into your theory?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Sorry, I'm just trying to understand. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to explain something. No,
you're doing great.
Really
I just lost the thread for 1 second.
Changes in the American electorate, right?
Yes.
And then the electorate, you guys have to keep in mind, I don't know how old I know Ben's, you got to be around my age or older. I don't know how old you are. I'm going to go with 20.
I was 12 when Barack Obama
I'm going to go with
elected.
20, you got to be 20. But, the internet is developing. The blogosphere is developing. Silver comes out with his stuff. Foolish me. I'm I think I probably need to go to graduate school to be able to become a political analyst because otherwise no one will take me seriously. Turns out I'm a woman. No one will take me seriously ever anyway. So why did I bother? No, I'm just kidding. Anyway, so the internet is developing, and election Twitter develops. I mean, this is something election analysis world develops, and this is something really, really profoundly important to understand. All the data that we have now, it dries up, really quickly if you start to look back for data 2004 and back. Even polls, people will contact me, where's all the primary polling from 2000? And I'm it didn't exist, dude. And there were hardly any debates either in those primaries. The world we live in is really centric to the internet because it made information so cheap to produce and communicate. So anyway, but
it also made information so easy to index. There were just there was this rise of all of these sorry, I don't want to break in, but
it's okay.
All of these blogs broke in, TPN, Daily Kos, everything that were just literally blogging all of the polls and doing their own polling every single day for the 2008 election, and then putting all the polls together, and people took that for granted. That was always something that should have existed, and it just wasn't being published. And I was no, that's actually work to publish that and put those all together.
If you were to map this shit out, it would be exponential, the data availability, and then the time that Nate and all those guys, Cohen, all come to age and cut their teeth, they do it all during the Obama administration. So they get used to this electorate that exists over that time period. And I make these points in all of from my very first writing, which drops in that blog post with my first house forecast and on. But anyway, they get used to an electorate that I come out in that first post and argue that electorate is dead. It is never going to exist, not during at least the time that Donald Trump is in the office. And the reason is because you have never seen this, demographic is destiny, population. You've never seen it motivated. You've only ever seen it happy and fat, getting Sonia Sotomayor confirmed on the Supreme Court and Elena Kagan and Barack Obama in office. You've never seen it terrified, and it's about to get a shit show, not just a little scary, not just Jeb. It's going to get Donald Trump, and it's going to be freaked out. And there's these long-term coalitional realignments that, of course, I've studied, as a PhD. With white college graduates, because minority voters are, especially African Americans, very aligned with the Democratic Party. So we don't really talk about white preferences a lot. That's why the language is so white-centric, in case people are wondering. But anyway, white college graduates are moving to the left, and non-college whites are moving to the right. And this has been going on for decades as culture, sexism, racism, those are issues that didn't exist back in the 60s and 70s because everybody agreed women should be in the kitchen and, racism was pretty rampant. These are new issues. And so the electorate's resorting on that. And Trump kind of, kerosenes it. And so my whole theory was, number one, we've never seen an election, a presidential election, where we have this massive turnout booster to that demographic destiny coalition. Number two, this realignment's about to hit turbo speed, especially amongst college educated women. And number three, because of polarization and hyperpartisanship, the electorate has hit a point where, like, and this is well documented in political science. This is not an argument that I make. The 33% of swing voters is actually 10 to 12%. Those are the people who are pure independents. The leaners are basically closet partisans. What my theoretical contribution is, though, is that actually there's two types of swings amongst these swing voters, and that is the vote choice swing of 100 voters, but also 100 voters that might sit out in 2016 when they voted in 2012 and then return to the electorate, right?
Okay. So so if there are 200 voters, your theory relies on this really interesting demographic sociological kind of theory, which is like, of 100 voters, like 100 are actually going to show up at the polls and swing, and 100 are going to decide, and then they're going to have another 100 that are trying to decide whether to vote at all. Mm-hmm. Is that basically kind of like...
And they're much more likely on the Democratic side, because I learned in 2018, and again, like Nate Cohen and these guys, for, you know, they don't want to be my friends, so they, you know, they think this.
But how do you marry those two groups?
Well, listen. They think the learning is a problem. I think the learning is a good thing. So in 2018, I thought the Republican coalition, and keep in mind we're talking about Republicans and indies that lean Republican, they're going to pull back their turnout because now they're fat and happy. They have all three branches of government, and they're going to relax the way that Democrats did over the Obama years. So my estimations kind of assumed a huge turnout increase for Democrats, pull back, right? And instead, what happened was exactly what I expected on the left. Republicans increased their turnout. Why? Because the way Republicans electioneer is all turnout. It's all base mobilization. Like, you watched the RNC last night. Like, there's very little swing voter other than the fear the black guy coming to your neighborhood stuff. And Trump he forces them to be all base mobilization. And instead of relaxing, their coalition actually increased their turnout in 2018. So I learned, like, what's going to happen in 2020 is we are going to see this huge turnout swing from Democrats, but only a fool would expect Republicans to decrease. Like, this idea that there's disaffected Republicans. I mean, there are. I mean, I'm on the Lincoln Project. That's who their whole shtick is. But like the base of the Republican Party, like the coalition of Republicans, are going to have huge turnout in 2020. It's not going to recede. It's going to be higher than it was in 2016. And the only reason it's not enough to win is that the surge that comes from the left, which again is Democrats and independents, plus pure independents are breaking in favor of Democrats in this cycle, is going to overcome that. But it's still like this idea that Republicans are like, ooh, I'm embarrassed. Like, they're still 90% of Republicans in the polls are voting for Trump. Like, there really is no degradation there. What we're seeing with Biden's enhanced lead, which is basically doubled since, like, my forecast model is focused on negative partisanship. Like, this forecast release is going to talk about a dual effect now. We have a negative partisanship effect and what I call the pandemic effect. And that is an enhanced effect where he's really doing better than he would have with independents because of the pandemic mismanagement. He's pulling off right-leaning independents that have never broken with Trump in all the years. They've never ebbed and flowed or anything. They have stayed with that man. And they voted for him and his party anyway in 2018, but they have reached their limit with the pandemic. So Biden, that's why Biden's at 8 points right now and not at 4, which is kind of where I expected him to be before this pandemic rolled in.
Ben, go ahead.
So let's, so before we turn
Sorry,
to the
my phone cut out. I had a phone call coming in I had to reject.
No worries. So before we turn to the Lincoln Project, I want to just ask you to walk through, people have an understanding of how Nate's model works, because it has a whole lot of assumptions that are programmed in mathematically, and then you throw in a whole lot of poll data, and basically the ongoing information that you're feeding it is poll data.
Right.
And it takes all the poll data and crunches it against these background assumptions which have been programmed, and it spits out, as you call it, a probabilistic number based on the poll data. So I want you to just walk us through what your model is doing to operationalize your idea of negative partisanship. Like, how does it work, and why does it not change no matter...
Yeah.
I mean, you do change it a little bit here and there.
No, not really. No, not the model.
You issue some updates.
Yeah, no, what I do, so like we're up to this point, the model is a structural model, so it's your co-host might understand this. It's a linear regression model, and it's modeling something completely different. It's completely different. What it's looking at is, so like when it came out of 2016, like I came up with this theory because I'm in Virginia, all right? It's election every year, and it's the bellwether state that always has the big gubernatorial post the presidential election. So I would watch these elections even before I realized I'd be living here. And I was like, oh man, this Virginia gubernatorial election is going to be a bloodbath for the Republicans, because they have like 30 House seats that they're going to defend, and, this open governor's race. And I just knew, like, every year, recent cycle had been close, but the Democrat would win because there's a demographic advantage in Northern Virginia that's growing from population change. But I just knew, like, I ain't going to be close this year. It's going to be a blowout, And so, like, when it happened, I was like, oh man, I should have put something out. Like, I'm just this liberal arts first year professor. I should have put something out formal on this. Like, how can I show, like, what I'm talking about quantitatively? Because what I'm talking about is, like, white college educated voters, especially college educated voters, especially whites, but college educated voters are, really realigning to Democrats, and polarization, like, really is all that matters. So, like, how can I model it? And I'm like an idiot, right? Statistically. So imagine, like, you were driving down the road in, like, what is that big desert in California? Death Valley. And your car, like, an axle broke, but, like, next to you was, like, a pipe and some string. And you're like, well, maybe I could, like, tie the string and get this axle. Like, I had basic, like, stats training. So I was like, well, I think I could model, like, this, like, thing, rudimentary. And so what I ended up modeling was the 2017 House of Delegate races in Virginia. And what I wanted to see was, how well does knowing, like, a district's college educated population and like a something that measures polarization. I used something called PVI, which is it's a spin-off of the Cook PVI scores, which are like competition scores, and then like diversity, right? I wanted to say, like, could I make a model that would explain the two-party vote share that Democrats got in these races, especially because for many of these races, the Democrats' two-party vote share was a huge departure over their historic performance, And so I built this model, I run it, and I was like, well, damn, that works really good, Like, if it works good backwards, or for this, like, maybe I can use it to predict, like, where Democrats will do well under these same conditions in 2018 in the midterms, right? So, like, so far, this negative partisanship, like, quantitatively has been demonstrated in, is looking at each state for the Electoral College and the Senate district for the House, and using those factors to kind of anticipate, like, where will Democrats get at or above 50%, and qualitatively, which I think there's no shame in. I think what Cook Political Report and Crystal Ball does is very quality stuff. It's all qualitative. There's no quantitative modeling involved in that work. They're looking at factors, like candidate quality and the district history and the fundraising and all these different, very good work with many years of great performance in race calls. So I'm doing that. After that, I'm like, okay, here's a state like Arizona. My model says the Democrats going to get close to 50%, but not quite at 50%. But I know that the nominee is Mark Kelly, and I know that Donald Trump is unpopular, and I know that it's been a shit show there for the pandemic. So I'm going to qualitatively rank that state as lean Democrat because I think it's going to go Democrat, right? Now, in the next couple of weeks, I'm bringing in a co-author, and he has developed a really exciting way to model, I think, negative partisanship. That's a completely different way, and it's going to introduce the audience back to something I think they're more comfortable with, which is probabilities. But the way to answer, I feel so embarrassed that I can't remember your co-host name. Kate. Sorry, Kate. It's been a day.
I can't usually remember.
Kate, I think you're going to like this because
Kate can't usually remember anyone's names anyway. So
remember how we were talking about your frustration is correct, and Natalie's critique, which I have promoted at every turn, and really have had quite a I think a serious odyssey personally too about conveying uncertainty to the audience about forecasting because, on one level, here I come. I'm like, I know exactly what's going to happen. And there's no doubt in my mind, they're going to flip this house and they're going to pick up this surplus of seats. And why won't anyone listen to me? Because polarization and this massive turnout surge are coming. Yes, I can see why that would be frustrating to some people. But in terms of the probabilistic elements that we're going to introduce, I remember how I was just telling you about these models, right? And the fact of the matter is, if it's 68 or 77, it doesn't really matter. It's about between 0 and 1 is what we're measuring. You could think about it between 0% and 100%, but the probability is between 0 and 1 of an event occurring. 0 means the event is not going to occur, and 1 means the event is going to occur. And so, if it's close to 50, that means that anything could happen. It could go either way, right? So it has to really be, I think, above 80 for you to say it's likely to fall this way, or below 20 to say it's likely to fall the other way. And anything that falls between 20 and 80 is basically a toss-up. So when we present this probabilistic data, we are going to be coding it that way. So it's very, very obvious to the end user. This is what this means. If it's not above 80, it's not you know what I mean? And I think that that will be an improvement over how probabilities get conveyed to general audiences.
So we have a number of questions to answer from the audience. I think we're going to start with Daniel.
Before we do,
go ahead, Ben.
I have one additional question, which is about the Lincoln Project.
Okay.
So I just want to say keep it relatively short because we do have 3 questions to get through. That's all.
So if I were as confident as your model is about the outcome of this election, I would feel no need to be part of the Lincoln Project because your model is really confident Trump is going to lose. And so why spend your time working with a project that's designed to persuade voters? You don't believe voter persuasion is a significant part of the electoral system here. Base mobilization is. So the Lincoln Project, which is all about persuading Republicans, it's okay to admit you made a mistake. He's a bad guy. He doesn't represent you. Seems to be somewhat at odds with the theory that you've just articulated. So reconcile the two sides of Rachel's brain.
Yeah, not at all, actually. Again, it would be at odds with the caricature that gets painted about my theory, because certainly at the end of the day, like what really people should understand. And I really would urge them to read the New Republic article that I put out. It's called Hate is on the Ballot. It's not my title. You don't get to title anything or determine how the press writes articles about you, as I'm sure, Ben, you're well aware of. And anyway, in that article, if you read it on a phone, it's really easy to miss. There's a table, an interactive, in which I went through voter files and did an analysis of like 20 congressional districts the point of all of that analysis was to show people, look, at the end of the day, in the polarized era, and really what my research is arguing is, like, on top of winning a persuasion argument, which frankly is hard to win when the fundamentals are against you, as the Trump campaign's about to find out. They're going to spend a whole week trying to run this persuasion or argument about, be afraid in the suburbs of destroyed America. But ultimately, the fundamentals are against them on that, pure independent bucket. So it's like rowing uphill or upstream against a very strong current. And my research argues actually, like in the polarized era, because of the shitty media that we have, especially, and the negativity of the Wild West campaign system, it's especially hard for the party in power because there's a bias against the party in power in the coverage. So it's very hard. But anyway, there's still, you want to reach out to those voters and turn them out and get them to, you have to, right? So my research certainly never argues there's no such thing as swing voters and they should not, invest in them. But my whole point is, Democrats lose elections when 70% of the electorate is Republican and they only turn out like 55%. So like when we look at this California 25th election that just happened, that's exactly what happened. They lost a seat that they just won in 2018, think they can win again in 2020, and they lost it and everyone got to see how elections play out, how I see every election play out, because it was partisan elections in an all-male system. And so everyone tracked the ballots. Republicans returned 14 points worth of more ballots. And so everyone could see it wasn't independents breaking in favor of the GOP candidate. It was Republicans out-balloting the Democrats. And that's a product of electioneering, to answer the question that somebody had in this thread. It's not just about the, genetics of Democrats being less good at voting. It's about electioneering and the system that Democrats use to do electioneering, which is subpar in terms of voter turnout. So, but if you want to win elections in the hyper-partisan environment, you can't can't have 70% turnout of Republicans and 60% of Democrats, or you're going to lose, right? In terms of Lincoln Project, that's just the one thing I'm a senior advisor about that everyone knows about. I'm involved in in a ton of different things, formally, informally. And the reason why, Ben, if you want to know, is in case you guys haven't noticed, the president, who is a current occupant of the White House, is a little bit abnormal in terms of his tenure there. You might be able to tell because he constantly tells people that if he loses the Democratic election, that it would then only be a product of fraud, and so it's just about trying to make sure we dot all of our I's and cross all of our T's, and that everyone's getting good, sound, smart, strategic advice in the process. So just trying to make myself as available as possible. And if that means I never sleep between now and election day, or possibly even after, then so be it, because I am not too enthused about becoming a citizen of Denmark or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest a little bit of sleep between now and election day. Just personally, it's not having sleep.
Yeah, I sleep fine. I actually sleep great. I sleep great. It's my only downtime.
Robin, would you like to start us off with the first question?
Sure. Thanks for coming on, Rachel. I was just wondering if your gut ever tells you something different than your data does, and how often is it right?
So, I have a huge indicator spreadsheet that I'm tracking. And then also, this ties into her question. So I have this big indicator spreadsheet that I'm tracking, and I'm looking, I was looking for data to confirm the far out forecast. So far, all of that has happened. I don't know what the world would have looked like without a pandemic fuck up, I was humble enough to say in the March update, hey, there's this thing happening that I've never seen before. It's shutting down the world economies. Like, who would have ever thought such a thing was possible? But I'm also smart enough to know Donald Trump was going to screw up handling it because he's a moron. And that's just an objective fact. The man is objectively not qualified for the job, and he never was. And you knew he was going to handle it well. Still, I'm astounded as to how bad he has handled it. And it really has exacerbated the disadvantages that he already had in the cycle. So, when I look at these indicators, though, what I want to see is proof of the pudding. And I see all the indicators stacking up exactly as I expect them to see. I'll be talking a lot about these on these go ahead, make my data election whisperer, shameless plug. Sorry, I got a text message. Go ahead, make my data election whisperer segments that I'm going to start putting out. But if those data points looked different, then I would follow the data, because ultimately what I care about is being right, and I have an additional burden to be right, because like many great women who have come into a field where they were first and then outcasted for, I guess, apparently having tits, I have to be right. So I'm definitely going to follow the data.
All right.
That is like an excellent answer. David, are you ready to go? Great.
So recognizing that quantifying a counterfactual is difficult, what is your assessment of the success of the Lincoln Project fostering and informing important questions? Part 2 is, in the event that there is a change of administration, do you see an ongoing need for something like the Lincoln Project?
Yeah, so two things on that. Number one, when they called to ask me to join, I was frank about two things. Number one, I have a long-term book project in progress in which many of them are stars, and it talks about, along with the media, obviously, how the campaign industry destroyed American democracy. And I was like, I'm reading a book about you, and now I'm actually like cheering them on, So, funny how those things go. I'm friends with Bill Crystal too, who'd have thought it. Anyway, so I also told him, the other thing I told him is that I am not only skeptical that you can sway any additional Republicans who haven't already moved, because some did, but like the movement really was prior to him winning the general. And since the general, there's been very little additional card-carrying Republican loss. I'm not saying zero, I'm just saying very little. Okay, we haven't seen an erosion of Republican identifiers. We haven't seen erosion in that 90-10 split on Trump support or Trump vote. And so I told them, though, I said, but that doesn't matter to me, because what you want to do and how you're doing it is going to be highly effective on right-leaning independents and pure independents. And it's going to fill in the gap on advertising and messaging that the Biden campaign and Democrats are going to be missing. So, let's go, because this is exactly what they need.
Do you think that the Lincoln Project is going to stick around?
Oh, yes. No, and if you have any doubts about the motivations of the Lincoln Project, their frankness, their seriousness, like what they're doing, I really urge you to watch one of their town halls on YouTube, especially the first one. These are not people that are on some secret cabal to beat Trump and then, come after Democrats right away in 2021 or whatever. These are people who are on a mission to destroy the modern Republican Party, because like me, they see the current construct of the Republican Party as a existential threat to American democracy, and are profoundly worried that if something doesn't change and really soon, we may be on the brink of something like an 1860 style, disturbance in the force. These are not positions that have come easily to these people. Stuart Stevens, especially, has written a book called It Was All a Lie, which I highly recommend people read. It's a very frank assessment of him coming to terms with how his Southern childhood and his experience in the GOP was, it wasn't, based on dog whistles or flirtations with racism, but really a bedrock principle, not that he doesn't think there could be a resurrection of like Rockefeller pre-1960s republicanism, but it's certainly nothing that he thinks can be fixed by 2021. And, at the end of the day, too, I'm very frank about myself. I am not a member of any political party, and I really have never been, because I was a single mom the whole time I was in college. I didn't go to school till I was 24. So I've been busy. Like, I've always been working 80 hours a week for the last, 2 decades, basically. 2 kids spaced out a long time. And I am definitely not a fan of Donald Trump. I am a fan of the idea of having 2 political parties that are organized around policies and issues. But as long as the Republican Party is doing what it's doing now, then I will be working against it.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So we've got we got to wrap up. Daniel, you get the last question.
So
and your giant chair that someday I'm expecting you to fade into entirely, and just
also,
sort
Ben,
of like I sometimes fade into the background. You're just going to disappear into that.
Yeah, that chair is kick ass. Like, that's got to be a gamer chair.
And it's
yeah.
Ben, quickly before we forget, you have to. Sorry, I feel like we're like on a road trip or something. Before we forget, you have to like gas up the car and refill the windshield wiper fluid
and do a poll.
But, do a poll. That was what I was going to
do a poll during the last question.
Okay, so Daniel, go ahead.
So, isn't Trump in some ways a forecaster's worst nightmare, given his attack against the post office, which creates massive uncertainty in terms of which votes are going to get counted and possibly affect people's perceptions about whether they want to vote or not? And
yes,
with voter suppression efforts.
Yes, I hope I didn't cut you off at all. I'm sorry, I was so enthusiastic to answer that. Yes, and indeed, this is actually a big point. When I released my forecast in 2019, the 2018 cycle certainly too, there was almost no uncertainty in my mind as the conditions of voter access. I had a very good grasp on which states had a suppressive system, institutionally. And you really, if you want to know more about that stuff from a political science perspective, I suggest picking up Political Behavior of the American Electorate. It's a great political science read as to what I'm talking about. And you can estimate, okay, California's got a very liberal small L voting system, and Georgia has a restrictive system, and you can guess like how that would impact turnout. So I knew, like without a doubt, that we were going to have about a 70% turnout rate, and that wasn't very, and where it would be high and where it would be low, and thus far, now I do not, right? And so in this September update, along with this fabulous co-author and his fabulous modeling, we will be introducing a very frank conversation about the uncertainty. And I really can't stress enough that we have a president of the United States, a sitting president of the United States, of his many direct assaults on democracy, who is, daily and through his actions with installing 2 months ago a campaign operative into the postmaster general position, something that is itself extraordinary, making direct attacks on the administration of elections. Granted, he is encumbered in that effort by the fact that elections are administered primarily through the states, but he will find some allies in these states that have Republican governors. I think that some will be less willing, like Mike DeWine in Ohio, than others like DeSantis in Florida. But my co-author and I are talking quite a bit about how to convey that and to model it. In fact, we're meeting right now, and I got to go because we're going to be talking about that tonight. And I'm really looking forward to at least conveying how that impacts modeling and forecasting. And I will say this, and I don't mean to attack Nate or Elliot. Again, I think they both, Elliot's obviously hasn't had an opportunity to test itself except for in the midterms. I think they both do fine work, and I have no desire to have enemies. But I will say that I don't think they are either of them quite capturing that type of uncertainty.
All right, we have got to run, as do you apparently. So we are going to wrap it up. Rachel Bitecover, thanks so much for joining us. We are joined tomorrow by the weird Venn diagram overlap between Kate's world, Rachel Bitecover's world, and my world. which is to say Rick Pildes, the only person in the world, I think, other than Bob Bauer, who does election law, national security law. He does some content kind of, he's kind of like a bit of all over the place.
Yeah,
he does free speech online stuff. He does bit of all kinds of things. He's a really interesting guy. He's very smart. And I promised you all a good Rick Pildes story in introducing him tomorrow. And I've got one. And that'll be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we do have election forecasts. And you can see which ones...
Hey, Sam, I'm finishing up this podcast real quick. Sorry.
You can see which ones bear biggest resemblance to reality. And you can sign off while taking your next